What does it feel like to pivot your brand and your business into thought leadership? Listen in to this conversation with Diane Diaz and Marisol Erlacher on this episode of the Speaking Your Brand podcast. More and more women are making an impact by starting businesses, running for office, and speaking up for what matters. With my background as a TV political analyst, entrepreneur, and speaker, I interview and coach purpose-driven women to shape their brands, grow their companies, and become recognized as influencers in their field. This is Speaking Your Brand, your place to learn how to persuasively communicate your message to your audience. Hi there, and welcome to the Speaking Your Brand podcast. I'm your host, Carol Cox. Have you been getting the feeling that you're ready to go bigger with your ideas and your message, that you want to have a bigger impact and reach more people? This is exactly what our guest today, therapist Marisol Erlacher, started feeling last year, especially as she took part in conversations with other BIPOC women who were recognizing the role that trauma has played in their leadership development and how it has shown up in their professional lives. Marisol is a therapist and a group practice owner, and over the past year and a half, she's realized that she wants to step more into her thought leadership. And as part of this, it's a shift of identity from being a therapist and a business owner into a thought leader. Marisol is currently in our Thought Leader Academy and has been working one-on-one with our lead speaking coach, Diane Diaz, on her thought leadership platform and signature talk. So I thought it'd be perfect for Diane and Marisol to have this conversation about Marisol stepping into her thought leadership, how listening to cues can guide you in identifying your thought leadership message, the scary and exciting aspects Marisol is experiencing as she's shifting her identity into thought leadership. And I love what she says towards the end of their conversation about her evolution as a thought leader. Marisol says, it's not about how other people see me, it's about how I'm seeing myself. Our Thought Leader Academy will be open for enrollment again this September. Get on the interest list by going to speakingyourbrand.com/academy. Again, that's speakingyourbrand.com/academy. All of the women in the program get both one-on-one coaching and the weekly Zoom group calls so that you can work on your thought leadership message and platform, your lead generation signature talk, your story-driven TED-style talk, as well as your visibility plan and how to generate revenue from speaking. Again, get on the interest list by going to speakingyourbrand.com/academy. Now, let's get on with the show. Welcome to the Speaking Your Brand podcast, Marisol.
Hi, thanks for having me, Diane.
Oh, I'm so excited that you're here. I love working with you, so I'm really excited for everybody to hear your story and talk about this idea of thought leadership and how you're using it to kind of pivot your brand. So why don't you take a second first, though, and tell our audience a little bit about yourself and what you do in your business.
Sure. So Marisol Erlacher, and I would say primarily at this point in my business, I am a therapist, a psychotherapist, and I work primarily with adults, high-functioning adults who have developmental trauma. So that's been the core of my practice. I'm also an EMDR therapist and do a lot of consultation related to EMDR therapy. And I also am moving into and shifting into different parts of my practice. And I also have a group practice connected with my individual practice. And so I have therapists that work with me and with whom I collaborate.
And how long have you been doing this type of work, Marisol?
A long time. So clinically, I've been working since 2004. I actually graduated in 2004, got my first full-time clinical position right before I graduated. I have been in private practice since 2007, about 2006, 2007.
Okay. And I'm curious too, I don't know if we've ever talked about this, like what was it that brought you to the area of work and specifically in developmental trauma? What did you have something, or was there something that you were interested in, or something that kind of called you to that sort of segment of the work?
I never thought that I would be a trauma therapist, to be quite honest. I'll say that my first understanding of what trauma was in my internship. And so I worked in a medical facility that did work with or provided services for people who were uninsured. And so at that time, they brought me in as a Spanish-speaking therapist, and primarily to work with people who presented with depression. And when I started to do that work, I recognized that the primary issue wasn't depression or anxiety or whatever the symptoms that clients were expressing. It was really trauma, and really rooted in some form of early trauma. And so that piqued my interest. And then as I continued to do that work, I realized that that was really what I wanted to focus on. And so my first clinical job, was working at a local rape crisis center. And I knew that that was going to be the best training ground for me to become a trauma therapist. And that's really where I fell in love with the work.
That is so interesting. Yeah, I can imagine that would be very rewarding. I mean, obviously challenging, but also really rewarding from the standpoint of how you're helping people.
Yeah, I've come to realize like my giftedness in this work is really my ability and capacity to conceptualize what's happening for people and to be able to communicate that and to know what the path forward is. And so I feel like that's my gift in this work. And then I probably would say, Diane, to be really honest, that probably my childhood plays a part in it in unconscious ways.
As it does with most people, I think.
There was probably a way that my own childhood trauma moved me in that direction, right? The ways that I could maybe understand a client's experience and be able to have a lens of that was broader or maybe more or maybe deeper than my own clinical experience. So I think that that's always an unfolding for most therapists in the course of their own personal work and then their own clinical work. And so I think, there was a part where I knew I had a gift and I loved it. And then a part that probably my own childhood played in being both good and attuned to that type of work.
That's so interesting and so telling, I think, and probably what makes you really good at what you do too, a level of empathy.
Yeah. And I think for most therapists, and what I always encourage therapists that I've worked with to do is to really do their own personal work.
Well, and I know that, Marisol, when we've been talking in some of our Thought Leader Academy, you brought up this idea of working with BIPOC and professional trauma. So can you give me, because I know, and we'll talk a little bit more in a moment about how your thought leadership message is kind of going in that direction, but give me an idea of what spurred the interest in that and how that came up for you as an idea of maybe being something, a bigger sort of platform that you can stand on and a bigger message for you.
I think that how this evolved for me really started from my own personal experience. So I think it was probably 2018, I had an experience that really propelled me to start to think about my own personal professional experience and how that would inform some of the things that I want to do in the future. And so I'm not sure I told this story. This is actually a very personal story. And I on my own podcast, I have gone back and forth about how I share this, and I haven't shared the details of it. But I was in a meeting, and it was a team meeting. So it was with the therapists that work with me and some of my administrative staff. And we were talking about ways that we wanted to transition the practice forward, which is really interesting now that I'm in that place right now in a different iteration of that whole experience. But we were in the meeting, and I'd gotten a text message from my sister. My sister had called me, and my sister never calls, we're usually we're a text messaging kind of family. And so I declined the call, and then she texted me and said, I need you to call me right away because mom is in jail. And I stepped away from the meeting, and luckily as a therapist, it's really easy to say, hey, I have to take a call. I'll be right back. No one asks any questions. I took that call. I came back, finished up the meeting, and decided, I have to deal with this when I get home. That was a really interesting, it's an interesting experience for lots of different reasons, right? But what was so striking for me in that moment was how I shared that experience with other people professionally, and how I started to show up in that moment that there was such a distinct dichotomy in terms of what was happening in my personal life and what was happening in my professional life. And I recognize that I think this is an experience that a lot of BIPOC women, and I speak, in terms of my own personal experience, have in terms of this dichotomy between our developmental experiences, our relationship to our communities, our relationship to our families, and how we have to navigate that in light of our professional lives and where we are. And so that propelled me to start a podcast specifically about that, like how professional BIPOC women are experienced trauma and have overcome and become resilient. And I've started to also, I think the thread that has run through that is how BIPOC women are having that experience, right, personally, whatever capacity that's happening for them, or the ways that they're trying to understand and unravel their own developmental experience. And also battling against the systemic forces that are not in our favor, right? And so I think that all of those things have come together for me, and it's something that I think about a lot. And I think that I feel very blessed. My sister is going to laugh because we talk about this a lot. #blessed. Shout out to my sister. I feel very blessed because I have a lot of BIPOC women that I'm in close relationship with, that I can have these conversations with. But I don't think that's the experience for a lot of BIPOC women who are in, different levels of leadership, are really trying to navigate different professional spaces in ways that our white counterparts don't have to do. So it's something that I think has been, again, brewing from my own personal professional experience, and that I'm privy to a lot of conversations about this with my personal circles.
So it almost sounds like this idea of thinking about professional trauma, specifically for BIPOC people, is not just what might be happening in the workplace, but what's also happening at home or in their personal lives that then the workplace doesn't allow them to deal with. So it's almost as if they're being traumatized twice.
Yeah, I think that there's this way that I think we have to navigate space differently in terms of our relationship to our families, our relationship to our communities, our relationship to or this responsibility that we have. And again, this is a generalization, right? But I was just having a conversation with a friend about this. I think I was interviewing them for the podcast, and we were talking about this idea, and this theme has come up a lot, that I think particularly for BIPOC women who are in leadership positions, are in professional spaces where you either are the only one at the table, you are someone who has not inhabited that space before. There's a lot of responsibility to your family, to your community, to people that you don't even know, that has a different level of heaviness or weightiness. And not that heaviness is a bad thing, but it's a different experience, where I think that having to hold that space, as well as try to navigate just regular challenges that come up in our professional lives, is very different. I think it's complex, and I think that there's not I think there are ways that we talk about microaggressions, racism, in the workplace that is general. But I think that there's a way that BIPOC women specifically have experiences that are more nuanced and more difficult to articulate.
I'm glad that you explained that, and to give me and our audience an understanding of what that experience might be like. And so with that in mind, then what was it that sort of called you to feel pulled to do work specifically in that space then? Was it feeling like, because you do experience that yourself, or you have experienced that yourself, and you have this understanding, is that you could bring then your therapy background, your knowledge and understanding to it? Or I want to share with the listeners kind of what brought you to this idea of I have a bigger message to share about this. I have a thought leadership message to share about this.
That's such a great question. I wish it was so like much more ordered, or like I had this like grand vision.
It never is.
It never is. I feel like so much of my professional life is so like serendipitous, or like it just happens. But I think that part of it for me was I felt like through the podcast, and really the podcast that it's the Resilience and Resistance podcast, and was really just a platform. It felt like a passion project. Like, wow, I get to like do this thing and like see what happens and just have conversations with people that I know and care about. I always joke that it's a podcast where I get to talk to my friends. But part of it was like in those conversations, I started to recognize like, oh, wait, there's something more here. There's a message that people, or something that is people are connecting to. And I think for me, I talk about this in my work as a trauma therapist, and I think this is part of like what I'm starting to understand or unravel in terms of thought leadership, is I really believe that part of what happens in trauma fundamentally is that people do not see, when they perpetrate trauma onto other humans, they don't see their humanity. And the victim or survivor of that trauma loses contact with their own humanity. And I think that there's this way that I'm able to bring the human experience forward in a way that is helpful and understandable. And I think that that's what connects us all, is our humanity, right? Ultimately. And so I think that that's kind of where I have started to like evolve in terms of thought leadership, is thinking about the conversations that I get to have with the people that I'm connected to, and people in professional spaces. And then thinking about, how do I bring the human experience to that? Because I think also in some ways, professionally, I think BIPOC individuals, I think BIPOC women, we tend to get tokenized, and people lose contact with our own humanity and experience and what that means. And so I think all of that propels me into a space of wanting to like create more and more space for a dialogue and an awareness and a reckoning of that.
Oh, Marisol, I think that's such a great observation that you made, is that BIPOC women tend to be tokenized, and we kind of lose the idea of the humanness of BIPOC women, BIPOC people, but women in particular, as we're talking about it. So I think that's a really great, just an example or idea or concept to our audience of listeners, is that when you're thinking of your thought leadership message, for you, this is something so personal, but also your experience as a therapist and your knowledge and expertise that you've built up over the years. And like you said, you have this podcast where you're actually having these conversations. It's kind of brought you this awareness of the ability to bring the human element back to it. Right. And so I think that that's such a great piece of insight of part of what it means to be a thought leader, is that you're bringing that human connection to this, whatever the concept is that you're talking about. Right. And so, and particularly this particular concept was so important to bring the human element to, because it involves people who've been marginalized. Mm-hmm. You as the thought leader can have such a great impact in that way.
Yeah. And I have to say, like, I think in this, like, if thinking about the evolution of this for me, I have struggled with this idea of what it means to be my identity as a therapist, the evolution of my identity in this area. That I would not say is like, there was never a time when I think I intentionally was like, me as a trauma therapist have a lot to bring to this conversation. As, I wish I could say I was much more aware, intentional about that.
Sure.
I still think that I'm trying to come to terms with that, with how my experience, my expertise can inform what I want to put out into the world. I think that is still a challenge.
Yeah, and I think that's normal going into thought leadership, or looking at yourself as a thought leader as an evolution, and you're in the process of the evolution. And so it's not always 100% clear, but you must have had some idea when you reached out to Speaking Your Brand, and we chatted initially way back when, Was there some instance or some idea that came to mind, or was there something specific that happened that pushed you to think, oh, I have a bigger message? What was that like? What did it look like?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that, to be quite honest, I think that for many years, I kind of put my head down and did the work of a therapist. There are lots of ways that I thought of myself as like a little bit of an exception as a therapist, because I feel like I try to engage in different ways in the community. I think of myself as a small business owner. I think of myself as someone who has something to contribute civically. I think that service to my community has always been really important. And so I think that I had this idea of what my work looked like and the way that it needed to go. And I just put my head down and I had a vision of what I wanted to do professionally. And so that was disrupted a little bit in 2020, even though my workload increased significantly, right? Because the need was so great and continues to be great. What I started to notice was people were reaching out to me and asking me to talk to their staff or talk to their employees about what is the impact of trauma right now? How can people start to work with the anxiety that they're experiencing? What is the impact? How do people start to understand that? And a lot of it were just, a lot of these requests were from friends who are, heads of nonprofits or different organizations. And I started to recognize that, and this is like, again, for all the listeners, so much of my professional life is so like, people are like, how did she not know that before? It's really my own process. Things have to be,
it just unfolds.
happen to me. And I'm like, oh, actually, that could be helpful. That's useful to people. So as I was doing some of this work, I realized like people really benefit from understanding the impact of trauma just in their normal lives, right? Like how our nervous system functions, how that impacts our work, our relationships, our ability to show up, like how being at home can be challenging and why it's challenging. And so I think that was the impetus for me kind of expanding, like kind of getting out of like putting my head down and just, being a therapist and realizing like I could have a bigger impact, impact I say is, like I could do something different here. And I think I'm ready. I think I'm ready to do something different. And so that was somewhat of the impetus. Like, as I'm starting to think through this, what could be my bigger message? What could be the thing that feels important for me in this moment?
Yeah, I love that. And I think that's a really great point. This idea of, being out in the community. You obviously listened to your quote unquote audience, right? So anybody reaching out to you saying, hey, could you come and talk to us about trauma or what's going on or what people are dealing with mental health wise? I think when you listen to your audience, they are sort of telling you maybe this is an area that you could be a thought leader in, obviously not in those words, but if you listen closely, it's almost like market research, right? To help you understand where you might take your brand, how you might pivot it.
Mm-hmm. So. And again, I think you and I had this conversation when I was kind of thinking through some of this, and it was very interesting because I think we had a call, and then I went to a dinner that was hosted for a friend who had like just received like 30 under 30, and we were all around a table talking, and someone had said something about, women of color can't get to the level that we're at without some form of trauma.
Oh my gosh, yeah.
And so we were having this conversation about it. And wow, this is so interesting because this is just what I was talking about this morning. And a lot of things have happened since then. I think that we're getting more and more insight about how women of color professionally have these challenges that are very unique. And we tend to look at the things that are happening in the present, right? And we don't see the nuances in terms of the impact. And so I think that all of that has really, I've been much more attuned to it. I've been thinking through it, and I've been thinking, how to have more of those conversations and really put the pieces together for myself So yeah, definitely all of my friends, for any friend that's going to listen to this, you all are my subjects, my research, panels. They give me a lot of information.
That's great though. And you're listening to what people are telling you and and it doesn't mean you have to act on everything, but I think looking for those cues, because as you said, it's not a straight line. The work that you do isn't a straight line in your career from here to there in the next place. It kind of just unfolds. And the reality is that's true for, I think, most people. Once you start looking back on it, you're like, oh no, just kind of like you said, it's very much serendipitous. But if you can pay attention, you can see those cues, which is what you did. You paid attention and said, oh, this is an area that looks like it has a bigger need or for a message and for learning and for someone to talk about it. And that's where you come in, because you're the trained person with this, with this subject matter. So I love that you paid attention to that and saw sort of a place to kind of move into, a place to shift into with your brand, which is good. You have to seize those moments, right? So with that in mind, then, Marisol, when you think about that and you think about those conversations you've been having and you think about shifting your brand, what does thought leadership look like to you? So if you're a thought leader in that space, what does it kind of look like? What are you doing? Who are you talking to? Give us an idea of what you feel like that looks like. And there's no right or wrong answer, but just what are your thoughts? That's a big question.
No, this is an appropriate question. It's something that I'm trying to really figure out. And it's interesting as I'm starting to make this transition out of clinical work, which again, I never thought I would do. And clients have asked me, like, well, what are you going to do? And I was like, that's a great question. I'm going to do something. Something's going to happen.
Yeah.
Again, I think that what I've come to and tried to understand in terms of my own strengths, like how do my gifts as a therapist show up in a different space, right? Like as I think about transitioning my brand, I think about what is useful, right? About who I am as a therapist and what I bring in the clinical work. How is that useful in this, a different format? I think I come back to this idea of, I think I have an ability to conceptualize and make understandable concepts that are difficult and help people understand that and give a frame of and context for it that's different. So I think that I see myself speaking more, even though it terrifies me. I see myself doing more workshops and trainings with organizations, companies, with whomever wants to listen. I'm trying to think about, I feel like, and this has been true for me for a long time, I feel like there's something about my story that is important to put out into the world.
I agree.
And, I have lots of parts of my story that feel big. I think I'm sitting with this idea of how writing. So I'm trying to put together the idea for writing a book. My husband is an author. He's a poet and author. I know lots of writers. So I always feel very humbled by this idea of being a writer, because authors, novels, fiction, nonfiction became such a part of my own healing journey as a child. So I'm thinking about like how my story interacts with my ideas of thought leadership and what that's going to look like. So there are lots of things that I'm looking to do and kind of refining them. So, but I think that the thing that scares me the most is, as a therapist, it's one-on-one, and it's like the perfect outlet or the perfect profession for an introvert.
Yes.
And so
good point.
Putting myself out there has always been very fraught for me.
Sure.
It feels very vulnerable and it feels very risky in a lot of ways. So that's that. Those are my ideas. The next phase is how do I build on what I know are my talents and my strengths and really shift those to, be used differently in the world.
Yeah, and those are really great points. And I think you make a good observation about it feeling risky, and especially if you're an introvert, which I also am. So I completely understand the idea that putting yourself out there more than just one-on-one feels very risky and very vulnerable. And but the good news is you already have a little bit of an audience. So you said you've been speaking with different friends. And they're the ones who kind of share these stories that every BIPOC woman has had trauma, right? That they couldn't have gotten to where they were without that. And you have an audience on your podcast. So you know that you have a warm and friendly group of people who already connect with what you share. So that is going to be helpful to getting your message out there to, build your thought leadership and kind of shift how people see you and build a bigger message around what your thought leadership platform is. So speaking of your podcast then, and maybe this is a kind of like a two-part question, I guess. So you have the podcast. Tell us a little bit about this idea about your thought leadership message and doing this podcast series that we had talked about. You had talked about maybe doing a podcast series about this topic. So tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah. So the Capsule podcast series, I don't even know if that's the right term, but
yes.
is called Work Trauma is Real.
Yes.
And so it's just four interviews that I did with different women who I know personally have talked about their own work trauma. And it's funny because I think that I've heard so many of them share different stories, or some of them share different stories. And then, when we did the interviews, we kind of talked about these like bigger and broader concepts, not necessarily the things that happened, which I think was really also very illuminating for me, because I was like, I wanted to be like, tell the story about the time.
Right.
When your boss, I'll tell the story about the time that, but I think they evolved into like these bigger conversations around like, those experiences were informative in a lot of ways. And I think that that's true for myself is, when I think about the work trauma that I've experienced, I think specifically what comes to mind is, there's so many different, things that are coming to mind. I think even starting in graduate school in this profession where, people of color are severely underrepresented in this profession. And, I think that has changed since I graduated, but, just being in a program where I really felt like there were so many ways and challenges that came up because of my identity. And, and that continued to be so in terms of my professional life, even though I was pretty isolated, but I started to like understand those experiences and use them to be able to propel me forward. And so I think that's what really came out of those conversations is this idea of like how those were always informative and useful. And not that is like dismissive or accepting of those traumatic experiences or how they continue to show up. But I think it was like this understanding of how that informed who they were as leaders. Yeah, so I'm excited about putting that out because I think that it really helped me. And again, to your point, like those conversations really helped me think more about some things that I hadn't really been tuning my mind into. Like I said, I was like, ooh, let's talk about that thing, that juicy thing. And that really was not what evolved. It was something really different.
That's so good. And I think it just goes to show you that just doing the thing. So you had this, when we talked, you had this idea for this sort of capsule, this little series of 4 interviews, you did them. So just like ripping the Band-Aid off and just doing the thing then informs the next level of understanding of what your thought leadership message is, right? Mm-hmm. So it's so important to take action on the thing.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a true believer in that. Someone who told me, I think a coach that I worked with previously said this, and really and truly, this is probably one of the things that I was like, oh, this is my takeaway from my whole year with this person. There were other things, but I'm just saying this is the thing that I come back to quite often is like this idea that imperfect action is better than perfect inaction.
Yes.
And, so much of this, as I'm stepping into this new brand, this new way that I'll be professionally, I constantly, when I get in this mode of panic and, like, I don't know how to do this and I don't know what I'm terrified. I just think, maybe just taking action is better than not doing anything. And I'm 100% going to fail in this process. And I'm okay with that. And I think that, the other thing that really propels me forward is this idea of, I have a conflicted relationship with this, a concept, but this idea of representation is really important to me. And in a lot of ways, that is, in my experience, something that drives me forward as well. Like, I have a voice. I have a way that I can use it now. I'm doing things that other women who carry my identity may not have done previous to me. And that's important to me. And so I'm always thinking about that when I think about like, I shouldn't do it. I'm like, I just have to.
Yeah. I think, who was it that said, if not you, then who? If not now, then when, right?
Mm-hmm.
Putting it out there. I think putting it out there in an imperfect way has so much more of an impact, of course, than just not putting it out there. So whatever that looks like, and the information you get back that you can then iterate on is so valuable. And I think, to your point, you do have a voice and you do have a platform. And so using it in that way is so meaningful to you and to the people that are listening to your podcast. So tell us, when does that series air?
That's a great question, Diane. No, it's going to air this month.
To put you on the spot. Okay, good.
I'm hoping.
So we're in July right now. So
I'm hoping that like before the end of the month, I can launch the series and it'll come out weekly. So I'm shooting for next week. I'm shooting for next week. There were some.
Okay, that wasn't to pressure you.
No. There were little things that I knew would be niggly things, like we need different music. I need to think about this for a capsule podcast. Whereas
yes.
the other podcast is a little bit more streamlined enough. But so I'm working on it. But I'm excited. Yeah. So this July, we're hoping to put it out. We're also trying to put out the new season of the Resilience and Resistance podcast. And so both things are trying to happen at the same time. So
with that in mind, then, if this is sort of, we'll say this is like the first exposure that people will have to your thought leadership message and this kind of shift that you're making as far as kind of what you talk about, who is the audience that you really want to reach with that? And what is it that you imagine for them as far as a shift that they'll make in their thinking, or maybe how they view themselves or how they look at trauma?
I think that my audience, I've always envisioned that it would be either women like me, right? Like BIPOC women who are in their professional careers at this stage, who are curious about how their experience, informs their professional life. I also think about women who are earlier in their careers, who I think that listening, I'm going to use this term in the way that I think is appropriate, is elders. I think that people who are elders in our community have a lot to say to us. And I feel like there are things that women who were mentors to me early on in my career told me things and said things to me that changed the course of my life. So I feel like both, right? So I feel like women like myself, and then also women who are earlier who need to hear, or need to hear some wisdom, or have insight, or see themselves mirrored in our conversations.
That's so good. I think that's so important. And you touched on this a little bit, but what is it, Marisol, that I would say, what scares you the most about this shift into this new area of thought leadership? And then what excites you the most about it? So two sides of the coin, but.
So the most terrifying part is that I feel like I've worked so hard to get here in my professional career. As a therapist, I feel like I had this vision about where I would be, or what I would consider success. Mm-hmm. And so I've built this thing that I feel like I could probably ride this wave for a really long time, very easily, And so that piece, to think about leaving that and building something new, is absolutely terrifying to me.
Sure.
For so many reasons. So it's like, what am I doing? Why don't I just do this thing? Because I worked so hard at it. Why am I going to do this other thing? This is not smart. So that's the most terrifying part, is abandoning that side. And I never thought I would. I thought I would be a therapist until I retired, doing the clinical work. Like I imagined myself until old age doing this work.
Sure.
So I'm shifting my whole identity with my relationship to my own identity. And then I think the piece that excites me the most is that when I first started my practice, I remember I was like, I don't know what I'm doing. I have no idea how to be a business person. I don't even know the first step, but I knew so deeply inside of me that this was going to be the thing that I would grow from. I knew just taking the step, I knew that I was going to learn and I was going to grow, even though it was going to be one of the most challenging things that I ever did and scariest things that I ever did. So I think I feel excited about who I'm going to become more than anything. I feel excited about, my future self, that all of the ways that I think I'm going to be are probably radically different than who I will evolve into. And I feel excited about that.
It's almost as if, Marisol, that you're thinking about how you've evolved and looking at how you've evolved has propelled you to the evolving. And even early on, you had to do so much work to get to where you were as a therapist doing the day-to-day. And that was an evolution, but that's actually what excites you now about doing this evolution. So it's like super meta, right?
Yeah.
And so
really is.
I would say too that if you pictured yourself, you said, you pictured yourself being a therapist, the hands-on day-to-day seeing clients therapist, doing that work until you just retire. But I would imagine that it's because, you, of course, you're very good at it, and also the impact you can make on people. But imagine the impact you can make if your thought leadership message is that much bigger, even if it's not the one-to-one, it's more of a one-to-many.
Mm-hmm.
So your impact is going to be even greater, if that means anything, which I know it's scary, but
it means something. It does. I think that
it is scary, though. I understand that.
It's so scary.
Sure.
It's so scary. And I think that part of it, I think of like 2007, 2004 Marisol and my vision for my life. And, the person that I was then is, oh my gosh, it's so different. And I still love that version. Like I still like have so much fondness for like so many, all those parts of myself. But I wonder, like in 5 years when I like look back at like 2021 Marisol, like I'm going to be like, wow, all those things that terrified me, in that moment, now they're different things that terrify me. And now I see myself in a different light, and I've kind of shed some old things that needed to be shed.
Oh, that's so good. I think when we're stepping into thought leadership, I think it's so important to have that awareness that you just said, is the shedding some things, because the Marisol of 2007 has allowed you to evolve to the Marisol of today. And both of those Marisols are going to allow you to evolve into the Marisol of the future that's going to have this bigger message. And so you do have to shed some things, but that doesn't mean that they go away completely. They're still in there, it's just a different view of who you are and a different sort of way of presenting yourself to the world.
Yeah. And owning it for myself. I think that's been my biggest takeaway of thought leadership development, is like, it's not even about how people perceive me. It's really about my perception of myself.
Oh my gosh, Marisol, let's repeat that one more time for everybody. It's so important.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's truly, really, really and truly, this evolution of this process and like understanding my own thought leadership is not about how other people perceive me. It's about how I perceive myself.
Yes.
And that has been my number one piece of work, personal work, that I've really been sitting with, is my own perception of who I am in this world.
So then let's bring it to present day then, and tell me a little bit about your experience in the Thought Leader Academy. What has that been like? What have been your biggest benefits that you've experienced while being in the Thought Leader Academy? How has it impacted the work you do, or even your goals in this way that you're kind of looking at yourself now in a little bit of a different light?
Yeah, I mean, I think that in so many ways it's been so extremely helpful. I did not, there were a couple of things that came up in the course of our time together where I was asked to do a speech, and I was like, Diane, I don't know how to do a speech. Please help me. And so just like that practical, like just serious, like I would wake up early every morning and watch, the webinars that you all provide. And, and really, I think what has been helpful for me is it doesn't feel as ambiguous, I think that having more concrete, here's what you have to do, here's what you need, here's how you do it, has been super helpful for me. Because, again, so much of what I do is based on most of the time is based on this oh, let me try that, or let's again, it's all been very serendipitous. I want to do this thing and I don't know how. And I feel like that has been so tremendously helpful to me. And then just there are times when even just my last hot seat, I was I don't really have anything. And then someone gave me feedback and I was my mind was blown. I took that note and I was yeah, the smallest thing, and I think this is true whenever you do a mastermind or whenever you do coaching. For me, it's always there's this one thing that I'm I never would have had that insight. So it's been super helpful for me in that way, is both, just insight that I didn't think I would gain. And then just the very practical help that you have given me has been invaluable. I could have never have gotten through that speech without you, really and truly.
Well, I'm so glad, Marisol. I've so enjoyed working with you. And I know also that the other women in the Thought Leader Academy get so much from your being there as well, in the sessions every time, and sharing thoughts. And I think there's so much to community and everybody sort of collectively sharing thoughts and ideas and supporting one another. So I think that's, I know that everybody gets so much out of your expertise and your knowledge and what you share as well. So thank you for being a part of the Thought Leader Academy. We truly enjoy you being there.
Well, I'm so glad that I made that call. Listen to the podcast on the plane, and that's how it happened. I don't even know where I was going.
Serendipity.
That's what I'm saying. If you take away anything from this podcast, your professional life is just serendipity, really and truly.
It's all serendipity, yes. All right. Well, thank you so much for being on the podcast, Marisol. I have truly enjoyed talking to you. So share with the listeners where they can connect with you and reach out to you.
Yeah. So if you come to my website, that's my therapy website, you can always contact me there, MarisolErlacher.com. You can also listen to the Resilience and Resistance podcast. And we have an Instagram account. I think it's Resistance and Resilience podcast. I think there's underscores, the Resilience and Resistance podcast. But I'm sure it's a unique name and you can find it.
Yes. And we'll put all those things in the show notes as links. So no worries. We will get it all in there.
Awesome.
All right. Well, thank you again, Marisol, for taking the time to chat with everybody and share your story. Thanks so much.
Yeah. Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks so much to Marisol for coming on the podcast. And thanks so much to Diane for an excellent interview. I really enjoyed listening to their conversation. Marisol's podcast is called Resilience and Resistance, and the capsule podcast series that she and Diane mentioned in this episode is live now. So you can go see that on her podcast feed. There's a link in the show notes to Marisol's podcast and website, and to connect with us on social media. Don't forget to get on the interest list for our Thought Leader Academy. Enrollment will be opening soon. You can do so by going to speakingyourbrand.com/academy. Until next time, thanks for listening.